Welcome to the Sexual Misconduct Online Education module. This module is based on the Sexual Misconduct Standard of Practice for Registrants that is located on our website. You may find it helpful to follow along throughout the presentation. In this module, we will cover the NSCN mandate, what is the Sexual Misconduct Standard for Registrants, the therapeutic registrant-client relationship, within which we will discuss common qualities of the therapeutic registrant-client relationship, professional boundaries, and crossing professional boundaries and warning signs. What is and is not considered sexual misconduct, the sexual misconduct standard, who is a client, and the module will conclude with key points. The Nova Scotia College of Nursing mandate is to serve and protect the public interest, preserve the integrity of the nursing profession, and maintain public confidence in the ability of the nursing profession to regulate itself. There are approximately 23,000 registrants with NSCN that provide nursing services to Nova Scotians. This includes LPNs, RNs, and NPs. The Sexual Misconduct Standard for Registrants sets out the legal and professional expectations that describe the practice, behavioral, reporting, and participation expectations of all registrants in all practice roles and practice settings. A registrant is any individual registered with NSCN, whether they hold current licensure or not. Registrants also have accountability to their standards of practice and code of ethics for their respective designations. It is crucial to understand the therapeutic registrant-client relationship and the impacts of this relationship to the effectiveness of the care plan for the client. This relationship is based on trust, respect, protecting the client's dignity, autonomy, and privacy. These relationships are purposeful, goal-directed between a registrant and a client that protects the client's best interests and meets the client's needs. Registrants hold a position of power by having professional knowledge and skills that the client relies on, having access to the client's personal health information, and by being in a position of authority. The therapeutic registrant-client relationship has 5 common qualities. Number 1, trust. Registrants are trusted to act in the best interests of their clients and provide them with safe, competent, compassionate, and ethical care. Number 2, respect. Registrants recognize and value the intrinsic worth of each person and treat them with respect. Number 3, professional intimacy. Professional relationships in practice can create an atmosphere of physical, emotional, and psychological intimacy, which can increase the vulnerability of clients. In the therapeutic registrant-client relationship, professional intimacy is therapeutic, time-limited, and client-focused. Number 4, fiduciary duty. Registrants are required to put aside their own needs, act in the best interests of their clients, and avoid conflicts of interest. Registrants must be aware of their own behavior, values, emotional needs, and how their needs are separate from those of their clients. And finally, number 5, power. The therapeutic registrant-client relationship is one of unequal power. This results from the client's dependence on the services provided by registrants due to the registrant's unique knowledge and authority within the healthcare system, their access to confidential information about clients, and their ability to influence decisions. This power imbalance places clients in a position of vulnerability. Registrants are responsible to recognize the imbalance of power and to be aware of the potential for clients to feel intimidated or dependent. A therapeutic registrant-client relationship never includes any form of sexual behavior. Professional boundaries are the defining lines which separate the professional therapeutic behavior of a registrant from any which, well-intentioned or not, could harm or could reduce the benefit of the care provided. Within the therapeutic registrant-client relationship, registrants are required to maintain professional boundaries at all times to ensure the relationship is safe and respected regardless of the context or the length of the interaction. When a registrant departs from the limits of a therapeutic client relationship, intentionally or otherwise, it can result in a boundary crossing or a boundary violation. Registrants need to be cautious not to violate professional boundaries in the relationship. As mentioned previously, the therapeutic registrant-client relationship is one of unequal power. Given the power differential in the relationship, the duty to maintain professional boundaries always lies with the registrant and not the client. This pictorial provides some warning signs that registrants should pay attention to. These include giving personal contact information, communicating electronically, giving gifts, paying special attention to a client, discussing personal issues, changing assignments to care for a specific client, dressing differently for a particular client, frequently thinking about clients, feeling other members of the team do not understand a specific client, and keeping secrets with clients. Boundary crossings like these mentioned can lead to sexual misconduct. By recognizing the warning signs in yourself and colleagues, you can stop the behavior and prevent it from escalating to sexual misconduct. This tool, along with the Sexual Misconduct Standard Practice for Registrants, can help you navigate the process. Boundary crossings and the warning signs are important components of what you will want to consider when reporting a violation, and we will discuss this further in the module. The Sexual Misconduct Standard states, a violation of professional boundaries is a breach of trust. Sexual misconduct by a registrant towards a client violates professional boundaries and constitutes professional misconduct. Sexual misconduct by a registrant towards a colleague constitutes professional misconduct. Sexual misconduct by a registrant towards others may constitute conduct unbecoming the profession. Before we discuss the sexual misconduct standard specifically, the next two slides will review what is and is not considered sexual misconduct. Sexual misconduct is any actual, threatened, or attempted sexualized behavior or remark by a registrant towards a client or in a client's presence or towards a colleague without the client's consent. Sexual misconduct includes but is not limited to the following acts or omissions: making sexually suggestive, flirtatious, or demeaning comments about a client's body, clothing, or sexual history, orientation, or preferences, discussing the registrant's sexual history, sexual preferences, or sexual fantasies with a client, any behavior, communication, gesture, or expression that could be reasonably interpreted by the client as sexual, rubbing against a client for sexual gratification, removing the client's clothing, gown, or draping without consent or emergent medical necessity. I would encourage you to review the Sexual Misconduct Standards of Practice for more information on the acts or omissions which constitute sexual misconduct included in the standard. Additionally, sexual abuse is a form of sexual misconduct, and the following acts between a registrant and a client constitute sexual abuse: sexual intercourse, genital to genital, genital to anal, oral to genital, or oral to anal contact, masturbation of a registrant by a client or in any client's presence, masturbation of a client by a registrant, encouraging the client to masturbate in the registrant's presence, sexualized touching of a client's genitals, anus, breasts, or buttocks. In the registrant-client relationship, any conduct, behavior, and comments that are clinically appropriate to the professional services provided does not constitute sexual misconduct, such as touching in the context of clinical care. This includes touching of the client's genitals, anus, breasts, or buttocks in the context of clinical care that is required and provided, such as for a clinically indicated physical assessment. A client's informed consent is always required prior to performing any professional service. Registrant must ensure clients understand why certain actions are performed, when actions are performed, how actions are performed, the importance and relevance of questions that may be sexual but clinically relevant, and how their answers to those questions inform their care plan. The Sexual Misconduct Standard has two standards. Standard 1. Registrants must not engage in sexual misconduct. There are 8 indicators in this standard, and they are: 1.1. Maintain the therapeutic and professional boundary with a client or former client. 1.2. Always obtain informed consent prior to performing an intervention that requires physical contact or requires discussions of sexual or intimate matters when clinically irrelevant. 1.3. Not engage in any sexual behaviors with a current client or any individual with whom a current client has an interdependent relationship, example a parent, guardian, child, spouse, partner, or the client's substitute decision maker where appropriate. 1.4. Not communicate with and solicit a client in person or through written or electronic means for the purpose of entering into a dating, sexual, or romantic relationship. 1.5. Not use any personal or health information obtained in the context of the registrant-client relationship to pursue a dating, sexual, or romantic relationship with a client or former client. 1.6. Not engage in any form of sexual behavior or behavior that could reasonably be perceived as sexual in nature with a client. 1.7. Not engage in any sexual behaviors with a former client until an appropriate amount of time has passed and the registrant has determined after review of the former client's circumstances that it is appropriate. And 1.8. Not engage in conduct or behavior with sexual connotation, character, or quality with any person which the registrant knows or ought reasonably to know would be objectionable, unwelcome, cause offense or humiliation to the person, or adversely affect the person's health and well-being. Standard 2. Registrants are required to report sexual misconduct if they have reasonable grounds to believe that the conduct of a regulated healthcare professional or an unregulated care provider constitutes sexual misconduct and cooperate with any regulatory body or committee of a regulatory body with respect to any regulatory processes related to sexual misconduct. This standard has 4 indicators, and they are: 2.1. Report to NSCN and their employer when they have reasonable grounds to believe that the conduct of a registrant constitutes sexual misconduct. 2.2. Report to the employer and the appropriate regulatory body when they have reasonable grounds to believe that the conduct of another regulated health professional constitutes sexual misconduct. 2.3. Report to the employer when they have reasonable grounds to believe that the conduct of an unregulated care provider constitutes sexual misconduct. And 2.4. Cooperate with any regulatory body or committee of the regulatory body's regulatory process regarding sexual misconduct. As you can see from the standard statements that we have just discussed, it is important you understand who the client is in the context of the standard. The client is the individual who is the recipient or intended recipient of healthcare services from a registrant, and where the context requires, includes a substitute decision maker for the recipient or intended recipient of healthcare services, and includes a vulnerable former client. For the purpose of this standard, a registrant's spouse or intimate partner is not considered a client. Please refer to our Professional Boundaries Practice Guideline for the expectations of registrants in circumstances where a registrant may be required to provide professional care to a client who is also a family member or friend. In looking at the registrant-client relationship, there are a number of factors to consider regardless if the client is a current, former, or vulnerable former client. We will go through each of these factors in detail over the next few slides, and I encourage you to follow along in the Sexual Misconduct Standard of Practice for Registrants document on pages 6 to 8. An individual is considered a current client when a registrant-client relationship has been or is intended to be formed and is ongoing. Consider the following factors. If the registrant has provided or is intended to provide a professional service for the client, if the registrant has contributed to or is intended to contribute to a health record or file of the client, if the client has consented to or will be asked to consent for a professional service being provided by the registrant, other factors relevant to the circumstances of the individual and the registrant. Registrants must never engage in sexual behavior with a current client. An individual is considered a former client when the registrant-client relationship has ended. Registrants considering engaging in any sexual behavior with a former client must consider all of the former client's circumstances. Failure to appropriately do so may result in a finding of professional misconduct or conduct unbecoming the profession. As you can see here, there are a number of considerations for registrants that are considering engaging in any sexual behavior with a former client. Given the power imbalance in the registrant-client relationship, there will always be a degree of vulnerability that exists for the former client. A period of time must pass to lessen the vulnerability. The exact length of time has not been defined as it may vary based on factors relevant to each former client's circumstances. Registrants considering engaging in any sexual behavior with a former client must consider all of the former client's circumstances. A vulnerable former client is an individual who is no longer a current client and who requires particular protection from sexual misconduct given their ongoing vulnerability. For some individuals, their degree of vulnerability is such that they will always be considered vulnerable, even when their care has ended. As you can see here, there are factors to consider that may increase the likelihood of a former client being vulnerable. If the registrant-client relationship was predominantly psychotherapeutic care, then the client will always be considered a vulnerable former client. This includes but is not limited to mental health, addictions, and chronic care. For other individuals, their circumstances may change such that they are no longer considered a vulnerable former client. Example, homelessness, financially insecure, unemployed. Registrants must never engage in any form of sexual behavior with a vulnerable former client. To conclude this module, we will leave you with some key points. The Sexual Misconduct Standard describes the practice, behavioral reporting, and participation expectations of all registrants in Nova Scotia in relation to sexual misconduct. The therapeutic registrant-client relationship is based on trust, respect, and protecting the client's dignity, autonomy, and privacy. Professional boundaries are the defining lines which separate the professional, therapeutic behavior of a registrant from any behavior which, well, intentioned or not, could harm or could reduce the benefit of care provided. Registrants must not engage in sexual misconduct with clients and colleagues. Registrants are required to report sexual misconduct by another regulated healthcare provider or an unregulated care provider. Thank you for participating in this online education module. We encourage you to reach out to a practice consultant should you have any questions. They can be reached at practice@nscn.ca.